Okay, so get ready because today we are going deep on some pretty serious stuff.
Yeah.
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You know that big one from 1948 after World War II. It was supposed to guarantee basic rights and freedoms to everyone, like literally everyone. So more than 70 years later, the big question is, does the UDHR reflect the world that we live in? Or is it just a beautiful dream that's kind of, faded with time? We are going to find out. And to help us navigate this huge topic, we are looking at an excerpt from a critical analysis by the Committee of Defense of Freedoms and Rights, the CDFR. And they don't hold back, let me tell you.
One thing that's really striking about the UDHR is that it came out of such immense hope. It was a response to just unbelievable horrors, a vision for a world where things like dignity and equality were just normal, not some exception.
Yeah, it's like humanity trying to pull itself out of the ashes of war and say, never again. But then, you look around and see just so much suffering and injustice. It really makes you wonder if we've actually learned anything at all.
And that's where the CDFR comes in with this very sharp critique. They argue that the UDHR, while powerful in its ideals, often gets undermined by, as they call it, selective application. So basically, some countries, and often those who say they are the champions of human rights, they pick and choose which rights to uphold and for whom.
So it's kind of like saying all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. But what does that actually look like in the real world?
Well, think about how refugees and migrants are treated. The CDFR points to policies in certain Western nations, things like family separations at the border, detaining people seeking asylum in awful conditions. And these practices go directly against Article 1 of the UDHR, which emphasizes the inherent dignity and equality of all human beings.
It's like a huge contrast. You have this document that's promising these universal rights, but then you have all these situations where people are stripped of their basic dignity just because they are looking for a better life.
Exactly. And the CDFR argues that this selective application of human rights is often fueled by this surge in right-wing populism and xenophobia. They point to politicians using these scare tactics to portray immigrants and minorities as, threats, which then justifies their discriminatory policies.
Yeah, that classic us versus them thing. But I'm guessing the CDFR doesn't just stop there. They must have something to say about how this all ties back to human rights, right?
Absolutely. They argue that this kind of rhetoric basically creates an environment where discrimination becomes normalized and even accepted. We are seeing it happen with the increase in hate crimes and prejudice, targeting people just because of their ethnicity or their religion or their sexual orientation. And all of that goes directly against that UDHR vision of, universal respect and equality. It's like the foundation is crumbling while we're trying to build on top of it.
This brings up a really important question for me, and hopefully for you listening too. Have you seen this disconnect playing out in your own life, in your part of the world, where those ideals of equality and dignity just don't match up with the reality on the ground?
It's something really worth thinking about, and it's exactly this disconnect that leads the CDFR to call out Western hypocrisy, as they call it. Basically, what they're saying is, it's not enough to just condemn human rights abuses that are happening somewhere else. Western nations also have to look at themselves and see if their own actions are really matching up with the principles that they say they are supporting.
So it's not just about pointing fingers, it's also about taking a good hard look in the mirror. But can you give us like a concrete example of what this hypocrisy actually looks like?
Well, one thing that the CDFR highlights is how some countries prioritize their economic interests over human rights. Think about those very profitable arms deals with regimes that are known for violating human rights. It's a situation where profit seems to be more important than basic human dignity.
So it's like turning a blind eye to suffering because it's just easier or maybe even profitable. And that's hard to hear.
It is. And what the CDFR is saying is that these kinds of contradictions make the whole human rights system seem less believable. I mean, how can we expect other countries to be held accountable when it seems like there are these double standards? It's like the referee is picking favorites.
So we've got this incredibly powerful document, this vision for a better world. But then we have the messy reality where things just don't match up. It makes me wonder, does the CDFR see any way to bridge this gap between what the UDHR says and what's actually happening?
They do, and they actually offer what they call a roadmap for action, which is basically a series of specific steps that they think can help close that gap and make the UDHR more than just words on paper.
Okay, I'm definitely interested in learning more about this roadmap. What's the first step?
Well, the first thing they say is that we need to reaffirm that human rights are universal. No more picking and choosing. These rights apply to everyone, everywhere, no matter their background, their beliefs, or their situation.
No exceptions. No special treatment. Everybody plays by the same rules.
I like that. What else is on the CDFR's list?
Next up, they say we urgently need to fight xenophobia and discrimination because they see those as major roadblocks to achieving what the UDHR is all about. It's about actively challenging those harmful ideas that lead to prejudice and create those dangerous divisions within society.
So moving away from fear and toward understanding. But how do we actually do that? It seems like such a huge task.
Well, the CDFR argues that education, responsible media coverage, and strong legal protections are all super important in this fight. It's about creating a social and legal environment where discrimination is not just like frowned upon, but where it's actively challenged and prevented.
So changing people's minds and hearts, but also having laws that protect people who are vulnerable.
Exactly. And then they talk about something that I think a lot of people don't think about when they talk about human rights, which is the link between economic inequality and people being denied basic rights. That is interesting. A lot of times we think of human rights in terms of politics or social stuff. But the CDFR is saying that economic justice is a human rights issue too.
Exactly. They point to Article 25 of the UDHR, which guarantees the right to an adequate standard of living. Things like food, clothing, housing, healthcare, and Social Security. They argue that when billions of people around the world are denied those things, it goes directly against their human rights.
It's not just about freedoms in the abstract. It's about people having what they need to live with dignity.
Exactly. And they bring up a powerful example. The COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemics just showed how much economic inequality is tied to human rights violations. While wealthy people were generally able to ride out the storm and even profit from it, a lot of vulnerable communities were hit much harder. They faced things like job losses, worse health care, and food insecurity.
Yeah. It's like the pandemic pulled back the curtain and showed these deep wounds of inequality that were already there.
Yeah, and the CDFR is saying that these inequalities aren't just like accidental side effects. They're built into the way our global economy works.
So if we really want to uphold the UDHR, we can't just focus on politics and social freedoms, right? We also need to deal with the root causes of economic injustice.
That's exactly what they're saying. They're calling for a fundamental shift in how we think about economic policy. We need a system that puts human well-being first and makes sure that everyone has a chance to live without poverty and deprivation.
That's a pretty big ask. It sounds like we'd have to completely change how things are done. Do they have any specific ideas for how to pull off such a huge change?
They do get pretty specific. They suggest things like progressive taxation, which means the wealthy pay more in taxes to fund social programs. They also support stronger protections for workers so people can have fair wages and safe workplaces. And they really stress the need to invest in public services like healthcare and education that are available to everyone no matter how much money they make or where they come from.
So they aren't talking about like Band-Aid solutions. They're talking about real change. But those changes seem so important if we're serious about making the UDHR real for everyone, not just a lucky few.
That's exactly the heart of their argument. It's about understanding that human rights are all connected. We can't have true equality and justice without addressing the economic systems that keep people unequal and create barriers to a good life. It's all connected.
So they're challenging that idea that economic rights are somehow separate or less important than other kinds of human rights.
Exactly. The CDFR wants us to have a more complete understanding of human rights, to see that economic security and social well-being are basic for a life of freedom and dignity. You can't have one without the other.
You know what I really like about the CDFR's analysis is that it's not just about blaming people or pointing fingers. It's about finding solutions and giving us a plan for a more just and fair world. It's giving us tools to make a difference.
Absolutely. They're offering a hopeful vision, a belief that we can create a world where the UDHR isn't just a document, it's something real for everyone.
And that's such an important message, especially now, when it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the problems in the world. It reminds us that we aren't powerless, that we have this shared vision for a better future where human dignity is at the center.
And as the CDFR points out, that vision won't happen on its own. It takes action, commitment, and a willingness to shake things up. We all have a part to play.
Well, this deep dive has definitely given us a lot to think about. We've only just scratched the surface of what the CDFR has to say, and there's still so much more to explore. We're back, and we are still digging into this powerful critique of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the Committee of Defense of Freedoms and Rights. Before we took a break, we were talking about how the CDFR sees economic inequality as, a big obstacle to reaching those UDHR goals. I'm really curious to hear more about what they think about this.
Yeah, they make a very strong case, basically arguing that you just can't talk about human rights without addressing the economic systems that cause and keep up these huge inequalities all over the world.
It's like saying a bird can't fly if you clip its wings,
Right.
right? Like you can't expect people to really use their rights if they're just trying to survive.
Exactly. And they bring up another really important point, this whole idea of international cooperation. They argue that big global problems, things like mass migration or climate change or pandemics, all of those things need solutions that involve everyone and that are based on those human rights principles. They're basically saying it's time to move past that every country for itself kind of thinking.
That makes sense. I mean, these things don't stop at borders, so why should our solutions? But let's get back to this idea of economic inequality for a minute. Earlier, you said that the CDFR thinks it's a direct violation of human rights. Can you say more about that?
Sure. They point to Article 25 of the UDHR, the one that guarantees a right to a good standard of living. This includes things like food, clothing, housing, healthcare, and social security. And the CDFR says that when you have billions of people living in poverty and they don't have access to these basic things, that's a direct violation of their human rights.
So it's not just about these abstract freedoms. It's about people having the things they need to live a life with dignity. But what are they proposing as solutions? Changing the whole global economic system just sounds impossible.
It is a huge challenge, but the CDFR does offer some specific strategies. They talk about things like progressive taxation, where people who have more money contribute a bigger percentage of their income to pay for social programs. They also push for better protections for workers so people can have decent wages and safe working conditions. And they say it's super important to invest in things like public services like healthcare and education that are accessible to everyone.
So they aren't just talking about charity or aid. They're talking about changing the system itself. But do they talk about accountability? How do we make sure that countries actually uphold these rights, especially with such strong economic forces in play?
They definitely do. The CDFR stresses how important it is to hold all governments accountable for what they do, whether they are democratic or authoritarian. They say that countries that violate human rights, whether it's directly or through neglect, need to face consequences.
But how do we actually make that happen in a world where power and influence often seem more important than justice?
They suggest a few different things. First, they say we need more transparency and independent monitoring of how countries are doing with human rights. They think that showing what's really going on is the first step to holding people accountable. Second, they want stronger international legal systems and groups that can enforce those laws.
So basically making sure those international agreements have some teeth and aren't just empty promises.
Exactly. And last but not least, they talk about the power of people speaking out and showing global solidarity. They really believe that people have the power to hold their leaders accountable and to push for a world where human rights are truly universal.
It's about people all over coming together and saying enough is enough. But it all comes back to a question we talked about before. Can we be hopeful? With all these problems and ways the world seems to be falling short of those ideals, is there any reason to believe that things can change?
I think what the CDFR would say is that hope isn't just sitting back and waiting, it's a call to action. The UDHR itself shows our collective belief in a better future, one where everyone's rights are respected and protected.
Like a blueprint for a more just world, right? Where dignity and equality are real and not just something we hope for.
Exactly. And the CDFR's analysis, while critical, does ultimately offer a way forward. They're not just pointing out the problems, but also giving us real solutions and a roadmap for action.
And that's why this conversation is so important. It's not just about understanding the UDHR, it's about understanding that each one of us can do something to make those ideals real.
Yeah, it's about realizing that human rights are not just something to watch from the sidelines. We can't just wait for someone else to fix things. We have to get involved in this struggle for justice and equality.
Well said. This has been a deep dive that's really made me think. Thank you for being with us as we've explored the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the CDFR's critical analysis.
It's been great sharing these ideas with you.
And as we wrap up this episode, we want to leave you with this. What are you going to do to make the UDHR more than just words on a page? How are you going to help build a world where human dignity really is at the center of everything? And we're back for our final look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with those insightful critiques from the Committee of Defense of Freedoms and Rights. This has been, a pretty heavy conversation, but important. We've unpacked a lot the complexities and challenges facing the UDHR today. But I always come away from these deep dives with one big question. What can we actually do? Like, how can we as individuals go beyond just knowing about these issues and actually make things better?
It's such a great question, and it's something that the CDFR grapples with too. They really believe that we can't just sit around and wait for governments or big organizations to fix everything. It's up to all of us to be involved in this fight for human rights, even if it feels like our actions are small.
I think that's where a lot of people kind of get stuck. You hear about all these huge problems all over the world, and you just feel overwhelmed. Like, what can one person actually do?
I totally get that. But the CDFR gives us some really practical ways to take action. They focus on a few key areas. First, they talk about the power of education. The more we know about human rights, the better we can spot violations, challenge unfairness, and push for change.
So knowledge is power. But we're not just talking about like memorizing the UDHR.
Right, exactly. It's about understanding how these rights actually work in the real world, how they connect to the stuff we see in our own communities and on a global level. It's about realizing that human rights aren't just some abstract ideas, they're really about how we treat each other and build a just world.
So it's about having these conversations about human rights every day, making it part of our lives, not just something we think about in school or during a podcast.
Absolutely. And beyond education, the CDFR encourages us to get involved in our communities. That could mean supporting groups that are working on human rights issues, volunteering our time, or even just speaking up when we see injustice happening right in front of us.
It's like putting those principles into action, walking the walk, as they say. But sometimes even speaking up can be scary. Where do you even begin?
Well, the CDFR really emphasizes that advocacy doesn't have to be some huge, grand gesture. It can be things like writing to your elected officials, signing petitions, sharing information on social media, or even just talking to your friends and family about these issues. It's about making people aware, changing the conversation, and showing that these things are important.
It's kind of like those ripples in a pond, right?
Yeah.
Small actions can still make a bigger difference.
Exactly. And finally, the CDFR reminds us that we need to hold ourselves accountable. We need to look at our own biases, challenge prejudice and discrimination when we see it, and try to live in a way that reflects those values of the UDHR.
It's like that saying, be the change you want to see, but more on a personal level, right?
Yes, totally. It's about realizing that we're all connected and that our choices and actions make a difference in the kind of world we create.
Hearing all this, it makes me think that the UDHR isn't just some old document. It's really a call to action, like an invitation to build a better world where those hopes for dignity and equality actually become real.
I agree completely. It reminds us that we have a choice, that we have power, and that even with all the problems we face, we can choose to be a force for good in this world.
That's a really powerful message to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We hope you found it thought-provoking, maybe a bit challenging, but ultimately we hope it made you feel empowered.
It's been a pleasure being here. And remember, the fight for human rights never ends, and we all have a role to play.
Until next time. Stay curious, stay engaged, and keep fighting for what's right.